Today is September 6th, 2024, and this is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. If you'd like to learn about the work that we're doing, preserving classical Catholic education, classical philosophy studies, and so on, you can visit us at classicalliberalarts.com, and I invite you to do so. Tonight, I'd like to talk about the virtue of fortitude or courage, but I think it's better to refer to it by the name fortitude, and I'll explain why in a little bit. When we look at our society, when we think about what's going on in the modern world, I get excited. I get excited to see what's going on, to see the unraveling of civilization, which is what we're watching. I don't think it's political. I don't think it's human. I think that there's something deeper and spiritual that's been developing for 400 years now, maybe actually 500 years now. I think that there's been a long, slow development of something of a great apostasy and rebellion against Christianity as it was established in the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, as Catholic thought was brought to its height under Thomas Aquinas with scholastic theology. I think that for 400 to 500 years there's been a developing rebellion that's been growing, it's been gaining popularity, it's been gaining strength, and it's getting wilder and wilder. It's getting more and more reckless and destructive. And I believe that this rebellion, this development, this rising that we're seeing is spoken about in the New Testament by the apostles, by Christ himself. We can find many passages in sacred scripture, specifically the New Testament, that teach us that life is going to get bad as we approach the end of time. And I'm not making any sort of prediction about any end times wackiness, but it really doesn't matter, because what often happens is that the evil ebbs and flows. We have these times of acute evil, these movements of great destruction and violence. And then in God's mercy, there's a time of peace and restoration, followed by another time of destruction and evil. And we see this again and again cycling through history. And every time the evil increases, people are led to think, Christians are led to think that this must be it. This must be the last wave, only to find that it's not the last wave. It's going to get worse. And as bad as things may have been at different times in the past, we can think about the early persecutions of the Christians. We can think about different times, the world wars, where there was just so much destruction and evil and death and suffering. Think about all kinds of evils that have been experienced by men. We always need to remind ourselves that these were all just warnings. These were all just alarms, as it were, calling us to get sober. And I don't mean sober with respect to drunkenness or drugs. I mean sober with respect to the seriousness of life, because it's going to get worse. And we can see in our generation right now the evil getting worse and worse. And when we look at the things going on, I think that Christians get too distracted by the people. I think they tend to look at other people as the sources of the evil rather than the instruments of the evil. And when I say that people are the instruments of the evil, I'm not excusing them from guilt, because we act in free will, but we don't act without influence. Even though we have free will, we're not free in the sense that we We face no influences. For example, if you think about a lab experiment, the whole point of a laboratory experiment is to try to remove all influences other than that which the scientist is trying to test. And so we try to eliminate all influences. When I say human beings are free, I don't mean we're free from outside influences. I mean that we have free will in our soul to make decisions that no one can influence in a way that overwhelms us, overpowers us, and so on. That's what free will is. Our will, I like to think of the will as a bird that lives inside of us in a cage. Nothing can touch it. Nothing can harm it. Nothing can reach it. It's always safe within this cage. It's free to make choices. And St. Augustine actually wrote about this when he wrote on free will. He wrote that there's nothing easier than salvation. There's nothing easier, because all that's required for salvation is for a man to turn his soul towards God, to choose to turn his soul towards God. That's really all that it takes to be saved. And that doesn't take away from the difficulty of perseverance and continuing to press on and fight and stand and resist temptations and so on. But all we've got to do is continue to turn ourselves to God. And God promises to give grace. And so the strength that's actually needed to overcome, the strength that's actually needed to persevere, is not a strength that we draw from ourselves. We don't pull ourselves up by the bootstraps, as it were. That strength comes from God. And we learn this in the gospel. Jesus said, he came to his own did not receive him, but to as many as received him, he gave to them power to become the sons of God. When we read the early history of the church in the life of the apostles after Pentecost, we see them confirmed by the Holy Spirit, and all of a sudden all of the timidity, all of the uncertainty, all of the cowardice and fear disappears, and we find the apostles standing face to face with evil, fearless in the face of their opponents. We see that courage, that fearlessness, that strength comes from God. It's grace. And yet, when we look back at ancient philosophy, we learn that fortitude is a natural virtue. It's a cardinal virtue. It's a virtue that men have exercised without the Holy Spirit, not necessarily without God's inspiration, but without the gift of the Holy Spirit, which didn't come until after Christ was glorified. And so we see that men were capable of great fortitude. Stories all throughout history of men who demonstrated true fortitude. One of the reasons why I love Roman history so much is because when you get into the lives of the noble Romans that Plutarch wrote about, there are just so many stories of extraordinary fortitude. And we need to read those stories. We need to read examples of courageous pre-Christian men, because pre-Christian men show us where the bar is at for natural human ability. They show us where the bar is. And Christianity, the grace that we receive as members of the Catholic Church through the sacraments, through the devotions and disciplines that Christ has given us in the Church, we have to rise above the bar of natural virtue. And so it's important for us to learn what natural virtue looks like. That's one of the greatest benefits of classical studies, is we can go back in history and read about philosophers that didn't fear being tortured. A good example is Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, who was threatened often with beatings and cruelty, and he was completely detached from his physical life in terms of groundless fear. and could actually talk about his body and his bodily suffering as if it was someone else's experience. We see that philosophical perfection that leads to great courage, great fortitude. We can see examples from famous warriors, famous soldiers, whether it's someone like Alexander the Great or the soldiers at Thermopylae in the Persian Wars, or Roman generals and military leaders who faced all kinds of dangers without flinching. It's good for us to see what natural fortitude looks like, because that shows us where the bar is before grace. Before grace. When I was about to get married, studying classics in college, and when I say studying classics in college, I'm not talking about the classics curriculum. I'm talking about my own studies. I remember reading the lives of the famous Greeks and Romans in Plutarch, and I remember thinking to myself, when I get married and have children, I don't know if they'll be Christians. I mean, I'm sure they'll be baptized, and we'll go to church and we'll teach them and show them the Christian life. But I don't know if they will choose to be Christians themselves. I can't give them grace and so on. But I don't see why they won't be virtuous. I don't see why I can't raise virtuous children. And it's strange, and I've talked about this before, because it's strange because in Christian circles we often find that the children are either saintly or they're useless. They're either extraordinarily good Christians or they're worldlings. And I think that that's a sign of life without philosophy, life without classical studies, life without an emphasis on natural virtue. Our children may not be Christians, but they should still be virtuous, because the virtues appeal to reason, whereas Christianity requires grace. Christianity requires, for example, the grace of faith to believe in what has been revealed. We can't explain why we believe. I can't explain why, when I was 18, 19 years old, I believed in the gospel. It just happened. It just happened. I believed. I can't explain why. We can't give ourselves hope. Hope is a theological virtue that's infused into the soul by God. I can't explain why I expect to go to heaven. I can't explain why I believe in heaven, why I hope in God's just rewards. I can't explain why I hope. I can't explain why I hope when things get difficult or dark, or when things don't appear like they're going to be successful. I can't explain what causes me to keep hoping and persevere through different trials and challenges. I can't explain that. I can't explain why other people don't continue to hope and persevere. And with charity, I can't explain why I desire to do good to someone, or why others would desire to do evil to someone. Even in my own life, when I sin, when I look upon my sins and reflect on my sins, I can't explain why I don't act with charity in one moment and I do act with charity in another moment. It's clear that faith, hope, and charity are subject to grace, and that's humbling for us, because we see that we can't live like Christ, we can't live like a saint, we can't do God's will because it's too good for us, naturally speaking. But when we look at the classical virtues, we can do them. We can practice the classical virtues. And if you don't know what the classical virtues are, you can read about these in Aristotle's Ethics, which I invite you to study with us in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. I promise you, you'll think it's one of the greatest studies you've ever done. But you can read about the classical virtues in the Catechism of the Catholic Church. In paragraphs 1805 to 1809, there's a description of the four classical or cardinal virtues. I like to think of them as the natural virtues. So as I said, the Catechism, paragraphs 1805 to 1809, you can read about the cardinal virtues: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And tonight I'd like to talk about fortitude, because as I said, to get back on track here, we can see that we're moving into a time of evil. The political scene highlights it. When you follow politics, when you watch the open, careless lying, when you can see that the politicians don't even pretend to be honest, when you can see that the politicians know that the voters are not concerned with virtue or honesty, not concerned with truth, not concerned with right and wrong, you can see the politicians just take off the masks and don't even pretend anymore. Look at this circus with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. They don't even do interviews in the months before the election. Everyone knows they can't answer questions. Everyone knows they have no real thoughtful policies. Everyone knows that. And they admit that. They won't even do an interview. They won't even face the questions of reporters. They don't care, because they know that the American voters don't care. The American voters don't care about policies. They can string together enough subgroups of deviant Americans to get enough votes to win the election. They know that. And that's all that they worry about. They don't even pretend to care about policies. And we see the same thing with Trump. Even though he's the Republican candidate and there's reasons for Christians to support the Republican Party, we watch Trump show himself willing to flip-flop on moral issues, willing to fight for abortion in one term, one election cycle, and then be willing to flip to a pro-choice position in another election cycle. And we can see just the lack of any real commitment to principle, but an eagerness, an ambition to win the election. And we can see that. Everyone knows that. And it's why our country is divided, because we know our opponents are dishonest and they know that we're dishonest as far as political interests are concerned. And so the scene in America is just getting darker and uglier day by day. And we can see that the Christians are the true Christians, those who are actually committed to principle, who are not going to flip-flop, who are not going to set any worldly ambitions above their duty to be faithful to what they know is revealed as God's will and commanded by God. We can see that those Christians are stuck in the middle of this two-party system, and the walls are closing in on them. We can see that they're becoming the enemies of both extreme sides of the political spectrum. And it's just getting more and more disrespectful, nastier and nastier, more and more reckless, more and more straightforward, that America is not interested in virtue. America is not interested in morality. And we know that as that develops, the Christians end up being the obstacle that stands between the world and the sin that it desires, and the world takes out its wrath and its lustful desires and every other evil. They take all of that out on the Christians during times of persecution. And so we can see that persecution is coming. We're definitely further towards that set of circumstances than we were earlier in my life. I can see things today that I didn't see 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and so on. And so we're going to be tested, and the virtue that's going to really determine how we do is going to be fortitude. Fortitude. Now, I'd like to read the definition of fortitude that's given in the Catechism. In paragraph 1808, we read, "Fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good." Fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. Fortitude strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and overcome obstacles in the moral life. Fortitude strengthens the resolve to resist temptations and overcome obstacles in the moral life. The virtue of fortitude enables one to conquer fear, even fear of death, and to face trials and persecutions. It disposes one even to renounce and sacrifice his life in defense of a just cause. This is fortitude, the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. Now, as I mentioned before, fortitude sometimes is referred to as courage. And I don't think we should do that. I think we should stick to the word fortitude. And the reason why is because the word fortitude, as far as I can understand, the word fortitude is nearer to the definition of this idea than courage. Fortitude, if we look at the word fortitude, if you look up fortitude in an English dictionary, you'll notice that it emphasizes simply strength. Fortitude is strength. And if we look at the word fortitude, if you know any Latin, you'll know that the word fortis means strong. So to fortify the wall of a city means to make it stronger. Fortitude can simply be understood as strength. And we have to understand what kind of strength this is. It's not physical strength. We don't build fortitude by taking jiu-jitsu classes or by going and lifting weights. There's no amount of deadlifts that's going to give you more fortitude. We can look back in history and see physically frail men filled with great fortitude, heroic fortitude. And we can find big, strong, tough guys running away in fear when trouble comes. This virtue of fortitude has nothing to do with any kind of physical strength or muscular strength. Fortitude is a moral virtue. A tiny little old lady can barely walk but be filled with fortitude. A young child can be filled with fortitude. And there are great examples in history of children who manifested the virtue of fortitude heroically. But I think it's good for us to just think of fortitude as strength. Fortitude is strength. Strength to be firm in difficulties and to be constant in the pursuit of good. Strength to resist temptations. Strength to overcome obstacles, not in professional life, not in our sports career, not all this worldly nonsense. Strength to overcome obstacles in the moral life. This is a moral virtue. This is about our moral life. Strength to be obedient to God's commands. Strength to be obedient to Christ's teachings. Strength to live the Catholic life when no one else lives the Catholic life. Strength to be faithful when there's no good reason to be faithful. When there's no honor in our society, when there's no material reward for being faithful, the strength to continue to be faithful, even in the face of discouragements, bad examples, scandals, and so on. That strength, firmness, constancy is what's meant by fortitude. And this is a virtue that we see many counterfeit cases of. Many counterfeit cases. We see this modern image of the man that I always see this. I don't know where it came from, but we see these men who are all juiced up, lifting weights, tattooed. They talk about their beards and their trucks and their guns and all this kind of stuff. And they strut around as some kind of physical tough guys. But they're not moral. And when we see someone who melts in the presence of a moral temptation, that's a person who does not have fortitude. They do not have strength, moral strength. The Proverbs, I don't know this proverb perfectly by memory, but you can Google it, and it's worth finding. It says that a man who controls his own spirit, a man who has self-control, is greater than a man who sacks cities. A man who controls his own spirit is greater than a man who sacks cities. And that's always significant for me, because when I was in college, I spent a lot of time studying the life of Alexander the Great. And he was an amazing individual. Very fascinating character. Was a leader of his father's army when he was 16 years old. Just a prodigious, amazing individual. Was taught by Aristotle himself directly. Aristotle was his private tutor. And he became the conqueror of the world. And I remember learning of one story, and I don't remember the name of the city or the details off the top of my head, but there was one story where his men were hesitant as they approached a city to attack the city. And Alexander went up and scaled the wall by himself and leapt into the enemy city alone. That was the kind of courage, even maybe an extreme. We might consider it audacity, that Alexander had. But I remember reading about Alexander and being so impressed by Alexander the Great, and I spent a lot of time studying Alexander. I think his life is neglected by most students today, most Christians today, and really shouldn't be. It's a very important life, a very important period of history that we should be very comfortable with, very, very knowledgeable of. It's very important. But I remember reading about Alexander and saying, wow, that's just such an... And I was very carnal still. I was just coming out of all my high school and sports and all this stuff. So I was very impressed by this kind of worldly courage. And then I remember learning that proverb that he who controls his own spirit is greater than he who sacks cities. And I could think of Alexander sacking cities and hearing the proverb say, you think Alexander's great, but Alexander is not as great as a man who controls his own spirit. That's what fortitude really is. And we see many of these tough guys. We see many of these guys talking about going to the gym, lifting weights, getting tattoos because they want to look like some kind of warriors, talking on social media about being crusaders and all this nonsense. But that's not courage. In fact, they may be talking about those things and trying to look that way because they don't have fortitude, not because it gives them fortitude. We don't see them doing many good works. We don't see them resisting many temptations or modeling any great virtue. We see them in the gym. We see them putting signs on their body, concerning themselves with how they look, worried about lifting weights, like I said. And I don't respect lifting weights because I know when I was a teenager, I played sports, and I never really liked lifting weights because I didn't think it was challenging. It wasn't exciting and challenging to me. Because when you play a sport, when you play a sport against an opponent, and I guess this applies to most sports, even if you don't directly face an opponent, even like track and field, pole vaulters and whatever the contest may be. What's different about sports from recreational weightlifting and things like that, exercise and so on, is that when you play sports, your opponent sets the bar, and you've got to overcome an opponent. When you exercise, you often set your own bar. You say, well, I'm going to go lift this amount of weight. I'm going to do this many sets, this many reps. I'm going to go take a 15-minute run today. I'm going to run 2 miles today or whatever. Private exercise allows us to set our own limits, to decide what we're going to do. In sports, our opponent determines how hard we're going to have to fight, how long we're going to have to fight if we want to win. It's different. It's very different. In the ancient world, it was taught that farmers make the best soldiers. Farmers make the best warriors. Cato taught this, the Roman Cato taught this in his book on agriculture. In the opening chapter, he taught that farmers make the best fighters, the best soldiers. And I think there's a reason for that relates to sports, even though sports themselves are artificial. In farming, and this doesn't mean hobby farming or, recreational gardening. Talking about real farming, and we're talking about farming when Cato was alive in ancient Rome. Farmers made the best warriors. And if you do farm work, and I've done a lot of farm work and a lot of manual farm work, one thing about real farm work is that what sets the bar for that work are factors that are out of your control. For example, we once had a field full of hay. It was a 20-acre field, and it had been cut for hay, and the hay was already dried and baled and was in the field, ready to be picked up, when all of a sudden we got news that a thunderstorm was coming, that there was going to be rain that we didn't expect as we were baling the hay. And so we had about an hour to get all of the hay baled before it got rained on and ruined. And so when you face a challenge like that, where your strength is almost irrelevant, and the job that has to be done and the timeline that's established by nature herself rather than your schedule forces you to work beyond your normal limits. It's that kind of pressure and difficulty of farm work that I think builds this virtue of fortitude, this strength to overcome difficulties, to be constant in doing good. The challenges of farm work are often very difficult. Some of the work that needs to be done, and again, a lot of this has been replaced by machinery and equipment and chemicals and things like that. But if you have an opportunity to experience old-fashioned farm work, the kind of work that men did throughout much of history, you face these grueling tasks that have almost unrealistic timelines that are determined by nature, and there's nothing that you can do except work as hard as you can until the job is finished. And there have been many times where I would come in at night and I'd be tired and sore, and I would wake up the morning just aching because I had to, hoe hundreds and hundreds of feet of vegetable rows or something else. And I do that intentionally, but farming, experiencing that kind of work and being challenged by standards that go beyond what you would set for yourself, I think that's where that virtue of fortitude comes from that Cato talked about. There are many different sources of fortitude that come up through farm life. But we see these things in ancient writings, and we look at modern society and we see counterfeit ideas about fortitude that are really shallow and untested. Like I said, the idea that like being masculine or being a man is to be virtuous or to have fortitude, and that's really not what fortitude is. As I said, a delicate woman can have great fortitude. A child can have great fortitude. An elderly woman can have fortitude. Many of the great saints who've been martyred heroically were not physically impressive individuals, but their hearts, their virtue was almost superhuman. And that's what this virtue of fortitude is really about. Fortitude is the moral virtue, moral strength that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. And you see here there are some assumptions. There are assumptions in this definition. It assumes that we're pursuing something good. It assumes that we're in pursuit of some good. And I would ask you to ask yourself, what good are you pursuing? What work, what mission have you undertaken that you would like to achieve? Some good work, some good Christian mission. What have you undertaken? What goal have you chosen to pursue as a Christian that requires constancy? I often see Christians talk about wanting to do things. They'll talk about wanting to get involved in education, for example, want to improve Christian education, want to promote vocations, want to do this, want to help the poor, want to evangelize, want to this or that, start a business, whatever, for good reasons. Let's say start a business because they'd like to run a business that operates according to strictly Christian principles, and they don't want to compromise in a secular workplace. Good works that they desire, good goals. And they'll talk about them, they'll complain about their situations, they'll complain about the state of things, they'll complain about this and that, and they'll talk about what they would like to do or what needs to get done, what work is needed. But then as soon as the time comes to say, all right, well, where do we start? What comes first? All of the obstacles start to come up. Oh, well, I've got this and I've got that, and I've got to get to bed tonight, and I've got to do this, and I've got to make sure that And you just see that there's no constancy in the pursuit of good. There's no constancy in the pursuit of good. I see it all the time because I work with homeschooling families. I'll see families come in and they've got kids, let's say, enrolled in a public school or even a Catholic school, and they'll just say, the school environment is I just don't feel comfortable with it. I feel like I'm not giving my children the support they need, the opportunities they need, the studies they need. We're not studying what wise men and saints have studied and taught, and go to bed at night and I just feel guilty. I just feel unsettled about the education that I'm giving my children. I know that I need to do better. I know that I need to look to the saints. I need to look to the doctors of the church. I need to have faith. I need to give my children the education that I would want my father to give me if I was a child. And they come in with all of these examples in mind of saints and wise men, all of these principles that they're talking about, all of these goals, saying all the right things, and they read about our program and they read what I've written about the history of education. They say, oh, we know this is it. We know this is it. And then they get started and they face difficulties and they immediately interpret difficulties as a reason to abort. They immediately interpret difficulties. Oh, the kids don't like this, or the kids are complaining, or the kids don't enjoy this study, or they don't like this, and I don't feel comfortable with this, and I don't understand why they need to learn this. What about this and that? What about all these modern things? What about SAT scores? What about college admission? What are they going to do about this? What are they going to be? Full of anxieties, full of groundless fears. And when it gets difficult, and all of the heroic virtue that they talked about, all of the heroic goals that they talked about need to be pursued in the face of difficulty, they melt. And that weakness is the lack of fortitude. Fortitude doesn't operate sporadically. Notice what it says. Fortitude is the moral virtue that ensures firmness and constancy. It doesn't mean rousing yourself up one time to face a raccoon that's out by the trash cans. That's not fortitude. Fortitude is a habit. It's a virtue. It's something that's practiced constantly. It's a moral virtue that consists in the constant and firm, it's the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. This is talking about a pursuit, a sustained pursuit of what is good, the firmness, the constancy that allows us to continue. And you can think of what Christ says about the Christian life. He said, he who perseveres to the end shall be saved. He who perseveres to the end, who overcomes all the difficulties and is constant in the pursuit of this end, the chief end, he will be saved. Fortitude is not some momentary, battle cry followed by a quick act of what might be considered courageous, but it's more than that. It's a virtue. It's a habit of the soul. It's something that's practiced consistently, that's persevered in as we pursue what's good. And as I said, I see this all the time. When the work becomes difficult, when it's not fun, when it becomes expensive and tiresome, and it's difficult to obtain the fruit that's desired, and we're not immediately gratified, Christians start hitting the abort button. And they excuse this. They excuse themselves by saying, maybe it's not God's will. Maybe it's not God's will. It doesn't seem like God is blessing this. And so on. And we see that, how does that language get reconciled with this definition of fortitude? This is really difficult. This isn't going very well. It's harder than I thought it was going to be. Cost more than I thought it was going to cost. Takes longer than I thought it was going to take. Doesn't fit into my spare time like I thought it would. How does that reconcile with this definition of fortitude? the moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. If we know what is good, we need to set our eyes upon it, and we need to persevere to the end. We may not accomplish it, and that's really not relevant. It doesn't say constancy in the achievement of the good, because the achievement is often not in our control. It's constancy in the pursuit of the good. It's constancy in the pursuit of what's good. In other words, we're going to pursue it until we die. You know, we hear the phrase that used to be spoken commonly, over my dead body. Over my dead body means that I'm either going to succeed or I'm going to die trying. Constancy in the pursuit of the good. That's fortitude. So when we see excuse making, when we see Christians latching on to whatever the latest excuse is, we get it again all the time. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we get our first email from a new family contacting us, looking at the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, all kinds of flowery Catholic language, friendly, excited, enthusiastic, psyched about everything they're reading on the website, and then the modern talk starts to come in. Oh, by the way, our son has this learning disability, our daughter has this problem, that disability, this, all of the technical terms, all of the modern school language, all. They're quitting before they even begin to try. They're excusing failure before they even exhaust themselves to do good. There's no constancy in the pursuit of good. There's a desire for immediate gratification, for painless victories, for cheap purchases, and so on. Parents contact us really wanting to know if they can buy certificates and diplomas. If we'll let them do whatever they want and then crown them with awards if they pay us. And as soon as they start learning what the standards are, what the requirements are, what the expectations are based on the principles of Christian learning, they have no interest. They're interested in appearances and not in the reality of the virtues, of the fulfillment of these goals. And this is I think the spirit that's common in modern Christianity that we've got to get ourselves free from. We've got to embrace fortitude and learn that difficulties are normal. They're the normal operating conditions for the Christian life. The pursuit of the good is difficult. When Jesus talked about the way to eternal life being narrow, the gate being narrow, and that there are few who find it, he's talking about this difficulty of the Christian life. And as I said, it's sort of a paradox because, like Augustine said, it's very easy. We simply need to turn to God. But at the same time, it's difficult and few will find it. We see this dilemma in the Christian life. How can it be simultaneously easy and difficult? Jesus can talk about it one day and say that it's impossible and almost no one will find it. It's easier for a camel to fit through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And then turn around and say, this is the work of God, that you believe in him whom he has sent. How can it go from so difficult to so simple? How can it be both easy and impossible? That's the dilemma of the Christian life because it relates to grace. Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light, and then turns around and says, take up the cross and follow me. Well, which one is it? Is it my yoke is easy and my burden is light? Or is it take up the cross? Whoever will not take up his cross is not worthy of me. Which one is it? It's both. How can it be both? By grace. And we don't hear that language much among Christians today. We hear excuses. We hear Christians making the same excuses that non-Christians make. They've got the same problems, the same reasons for quitting, for not aspiring after honorable things, for not taking on great challenges, for not pursuing goals worthy of Christian people. They've got all of the same excuses, all of the same impediments and weaknesses that unbelievers have. And you have to wonder, what is the strength that Christianity supposedly offers when Christians have all the same problems, are capable of nothing that non-Christians can't do? This is especially true, I feel, among Catholics. Remember, I'm a Protestant convert. I lived in a Protestant community in New Jersey when I was just finishing and out of college. I lived in a Christian community that was very, very strong. A Protestant community. They had their own school. They stood as a light in the world. They were salt of the earth people. They practiced the Christian faith according to Protestant understanding, and obviously I understand the faults of that, but much of what they did was good. And they were courageous in doing good. They knew that their children couldn't be educated in secular schools. They knew that they couldn't just send their kids to any school, but it had to be a school that was conducted according to their convictions. And so they started, built, and funded their own private school. And it was a small school. I think the number of students was only like 100 and under 200 certainly, but maybe somewhere between 100 and 170 students. They understood very clearly that it was their duty to provide their children with a school, because they were responsible to teach their children the Christian faith. They were responsible to raise their children in a Christian environment where their faith was nurtured like plants in a nursery. And so this small community of Protestants sacrificed everything and built their kids a school. And it turned out to be a beautiful, excellent school. Really special place as far as Christian schooling goes. And like I said, it wasn't wealthy, wasn't made up of rich people. There were no, superstar donors. I mean, there were some wealthy people, but it was mainly made up of a commitment of conscientious, committed, and courageous Christians that worked to achieve their goals and accepted whatever the circumstances required. The principal of the school, and I was only 23, 24 years old at the time. I was just a teacher then. But the principal drove a beat-up old van to school with his 6 or 7 kids, lived in a house that was actually, I think it was a barn that was converted into a house, never had any money, was poor voluntarily for the sake of administering this school. And he was the leader of the school. And he was a virtuous, excellent man who raised a great family and had great Christian kids, virtuous, good kids. So I saw Protestants live like that, sacrificially, simply for the sake of a goal. And then I look at Catholic communities, community like mine, for example. Our parish is not wealthy, but I notice the numbers for the offerings every week. It's $10,000, $12,000 a week donated by the people. There's no school. We have Faith Formation program at the parish, and every kid who goes to Faith Formation has to pay for all of his supplies, has to pay $60 to enroll in Faith Formation. So even though there's donations and financial support, and there probably would be more support, there's no school. It's just assumed that that's beyond us. And there are thousands of parishioners and no Catholic school. And yet, as I said, in northern New Jersey, very expensive place to live, there were 170 kids, and there was a school because it was a priority. It was a good that was pursued by the members of that church, and they pursued it at their own sacrifice. And we can see the different spirit. A much larger Catholic community can't do the things that a smaller Protestant community can do. And it's because they think that it needs to be done in some kind of luxury. And if it can't be done in convenience, if it can't be done in luxury, if everyone can't enjoy a comfortable salary, if everything can't be done the way the public schools do things, then there just won't be a school. We won't consider alternatives. We won't consider other options. We won't commit to the goal and then determine what the means should be so that we can achieve the goal. We'll commit to a certain standard of life, a certain idea of what work should feel like, how easy it should be, like we're a bunch of union employees. And if we find that it can't be done easily, then it just won't be done. And that contrast, in my experience, between a small Protestant church that built a great school with little resources and large Catholic parishes that have no schools, even though they have many more members, much more collective resources and so on, I think it's attributable to the lack of fortitude. The moral virtue that ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in the pursuit of good. It's why people quit homeschooling, even though they know all of the principles. They know everything when they start. They understand all of the goals. They understand the means. They understand the need. And when it gets difficult, they bail. Either the goals changed, either the principles changed, or they failed in the pursuit of what's good. They abandoned the pursuit of what's good. And that's a whole other topic, because many Christians just have, and I've mentioned this a couple times now, Catholics don't have realistic expectations. They have unrealistic expectations, and then they use those expectations as an excuse to quit. They use those expectations, or I should say they're defeated by their own unreasonable expectations. And they feel justified in quitting things because what they expect they judge to be impossible, and therefore they get into this sort of fatalism where they say, oh, it must not be God's will. And they basically say that if it's not easy, it must not be God's will. That doesn't sound like fortitude. So I'd like to challenge you. I know that many Catholics who want to do good listen to these talks. I want to challenge you to study the virtue of fortitude. Think about your life. Think about things that you can see need to be done. Good works that you see need to be done. Problems that you see need to be solved. And ask yourself, what would I need to do to achieve this good? What would I need to do to solve this problem? And don't allow a certain standard of living, a way of life, a level of comfort to get in the way of that question. What would I need to do to solve this problem? What would I need to do to achieve this goal? And you'll see that when you draw the map, as it were, when you write out the directions from where you are to that destination, you write out those directions. What you'll see is described in those directions is the life of saints. You'll see that that's all that the saints did. That's all they did. They saw a goal that needed to be achieved. They saw a work that needed to be performed. They saw a problem that needed to be solved. And they drew a set of directions, a business plan, as it were, that explained how to get from where they were to where they needed to be. And they accepted that plan no matter what it required. If there wasn't enough money for the books that were needed and a bed, they lived without a bed. If there wasn't enough time for sleep and prayer, they sacrificed sleep. And we can say, as I always mention, the saints were not these sort of crazy, mystical, weird people that did all kinds of strange things. They were very practical people who were so focused on the goals that they set, who were so resolute in the mission that they set out on, that whatever got in the way, they simply sacrificed. Whatever they couldn't have on that path, they were content to live without. We read about St. Paul saying to, I think it was Timothy, he said, "Let us be content with food and clothing." And he says, because godliness with contentment is great gain. We'll be content with food and clothing. We read about saints like St. Catherine we read about them sleeping on the floor and this and that. There's nothing weird or mystical about that. It was practical. It was, for them, necessary for the sake of the mission, for the sake of the goal. I read about St. Dominic, where he would sleep in the chapel, just sitting up, because he would be up into the night and wouldn't sleep much, and then wanted to be present for the morning prayers, and so he would just sleep sitting upright in the chapel so that he could easily wake up when it was time to pray. The saints were practical. They were realistic about what needed to get done, and they directed their will towards their goal. And the ability to keep the will directed towards the goal, even in the face of difficulties, that's fortitude. I think that's a helpful understanding of fortitude, the ability to keep the will directed towards the goal, even when things are difficult. That's fortitude. But the only way that we can even practice fortitude is by setting goals, by identifying problems that we're going to solve, God helping us, good works that we're going to achieve, missions that we're going to pursue, and again, not necessarily even achieve, but pursue. For example, my work in classical education, I don't know if I'll pursue, I don't know if I'll achieve a restoration of classical Catholic education. I don't know if anyone will follow me. I don't know if anyone will join me. I don't know that, but I honestly don't care. I understand what needs to be done. I understand the problems that need to be solved in education, many of which are practical things that no one wants to talk about, like the cost of education. We'll just avoid the topic like it's not significant, when it's crucial to the success of Christian education that it be affordable for everyone. and these practical concerns, I understand the problems. I can list them, the problems that need to be solved. And I've committed my life to pursuing the solution of those problems. And I'm just going to continue working as long as I can. Whether I achieve them or not, I'm going to achieve them or die trying. And I don't think that's heroic. I just think it's reasonable. It's practical. I want to see Christian education restored for God's glory, for the good of my fellow Christians, for the good of my own children and grandchildren. I don't want to leave it for someone else and let another generation go by where there's no progress made at all. I know that in many ways that I've raised awareness of the issues. I know that I've introduced people to the solution, even though it's in draft form, as it were, seed form. There are a number of people who know about the history of Catholic education, the principles of Catholic education, who would not know about it were it not for the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And so there are successes, short-term successes, partial successes. But when we set ourselves to accomplish a goal, it really doesn't matter whether it's accomplished or not, or whether we're the ones who accomplish it. What matters is that we take our best whack at it and exhaust ourselves trying to fix it, trying to solve it. Because even if we don't accomplish it all by ourselves, we can leave things in place for someone else to pick up and finish it. An example of that in Scripture is King David defeating all the enemies of Israel and wanting to be the king who builds God's temple. And though he wanted it, he was not given the opportunity to be the one to build the temple, mainly because he was a bloody warrior. And when he learned, when God actually told him that he would not be the one to build the temple, what did he do? You should be reading the life of David. What did he do when he learned that he wouldn't be the one to build the temple? He said, well, then I'm going to begin gathering supplies. And maybe my son will be the one who builds the temple. And so David began collecting supplies to leave behind for the construction of the temple. That's the spirit of fortitude, persevering to the end. When we see Christ carrying his cross, that's the spirit of fortitude, persevering to the end. Think about that paradox, carrying your own cross to the place of your execution. That's fortitude. Read about the martyrs of the early church during the persecutions in the Roman Empire. Those are examples of fortitude, real fortitude. And what the world is challenging us to do is to set our will towards goals that need to be achieved and pursue them with this fortitude, this strength that's not going to turn away, not going to quit, not going to yield, not going to be discouraged, but is going to be firm in difficulties and constant in the pursuit of good. Catholics have to learn to live with fortitude, because there are so many things that need to be done, and what's keeping us from doing them is not money, it's not manpower, it's not the government, it's not whoever the president is, it's not the Congress. What's keeping us from getting Christian works done is a lack of fortitude.